Okay, so welcome along to 30 Plus and Fabulous. This is Chris Leitch from Social Credit Party. Is that how you say it?
Yes,
The
it is.
Credit Party? Cool. And so, Chris, we're a group of women in the 30 plus age group. There are roughly about 30 something thousand in the group. And I'm just going to shut off the Facebook right now. Sorry, otherwise I'm going to get lots of notifications. So yeah, we're a group of, quite a few thousand women, and we just decided to run a political series, and now you're getting beat.
I know, sorry.
That's all right. We just decided to run a political series up until the elections, and we wanted to showcase some of the minority parties because just really because we felt like they weren't getting airtime. And then the more that I've been doing these interviews, the more I've discovered parties I didn't even know were there. so we're getting through you all one party at a time. So welcome along. Thanks so much for coming and sharing with us today. Just would you like to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about Social Credit and what they stand for?
Yes, certainly. Thank you for the opportunity too. And yes, there are a lot of smaller parties around these days. But Social Credit has been around for a very long time. It was first formed as a political party in 1953.
Wow.
Which was the year I was born. I'm not sure there's any connection between the two necessarily, but and it stood its first candidates in 1954 in the general election and has stood candidates ever since. Its peak of support was in 1981 when it actually got 21% of the nationwide vote across New Zealand.
Wow.
Which was an enormous amount when you consider the parties are bickering over, 6 and 7% these days.
Yes.
But of course, in 1981, the country was still operating under the first past the post type voting system. So Social Credit's reward for having 21% of the nationwide vote was only 2 MPs in Parliament. Had MMP been in play then, we would have had 24 MPs in Parliament, and that would have made a very significant difference to the progress of New Zealand as a country since then. Mm-hmm. For me, I've been involved with Social Credit since 1972 actively. My father was a candidate for Social Credit in the mid-60s when Social Credit got its first MP elected to Parliament in 1966. So a fairly long history in the party and activity within the party.
I'll say that's quite a history indeed. So interesting that you would say, Social Credit has been around for a long time, and now here I am calling you a minority party, but obviously that you come into favour and then out of favour and into favour and out of favour, and that's kind of the nature of politics, isn't it? How is it that Social Credit has so I'm learning about politics, and I'm not a politician and I'm not a journalist. I'm just a curious woman who would like to know more about the parties that we're not hearing about so much. So why do you think it is that we're not hearing so much about Social Credit just right now?
Look, I think the media, if you look at the media are run on the basis of selling advertising. And in order to sell advertising, they have to sell newspapers or sell audience ratings. And so newer parties that come along, controversy, all of that kind of stuff tends to get more media coverage than parties like Social Credit that have been around for such a long time. And you're right, there is a bit of waxing and waning of political party fortunes. Interestingly, I was just talking to another journalist earlier today, and I said to him, look, you realise there have been 100 political parties that have come and gone in New Zealand's political history.
Is that right?
And the 3 that are still around are the Labour Party, the National Party, and Social Credit, because Social Credit is the 3rd longest standing political party in New Zealand. So our fortunes haven't been wonderful over the past few years, but we are rebuilding and we're getting a big inflow of new members. And to some extent, that has come about because the economic times that we're in are very controversial. And there are things going on in the economic sphere that would never have been thought about 6 months, 7 months, 12 months ago.
That's right.
And so I think there are a lot of people looking at how this new environment economically has come into play, and whether there are any political options that support the kind of thing that's going on with the Reserve Bank in New Zealand here, currently in the process of creating $100 billion in new money. And that's just unheard of in New Zealand political history. But these are very unconventional times.
They are. So tell me just quickly before we get started, I want to talk about your policies and things, but tell me how, where are you getting the most sort of recognition or airtime in that at the moment?
Well, we're certainly doing a lot of work with Facebook. Mainstream media stuff is pretty difficult. As I say, they tend to want to cover the major parties and the controversial stuff. New Zealand First is going to be out of Parliament this time, so that gets lots of media coverage because it's controversial. All those kind of things. But we're certainly getting a lot of people coming to us through searching on the internet, looking at our Facebook posts. And being intrigued by what we're saying, because what we've been saying about the way the economy could work hasn't quite come to fruition, but certainly some of the aspects of it have come to fruition.
So it sounds a little bit like a political tortoise in the hare race. So with the way you're going at the moment, maybe you're plodding along, but you're actually going to gain some traction because of these economic times.
They're certainly gaining some traction because of that, because many economists and political commentators now are actually starting to talk about the concepts that social credit has talked about since it started. And that has opened up an environment where people are now questioning what they're reading from those economists and those commentators, and wondering whether there are political parties that have similar kind of views in terms of what they're promoting. And of course, they end up coming to social credit because we're the only political party that's promoting the kind of views that some of these economists are talking about.
Okay, so let's crack into some of these ideas and policies. Tell me, what would be your leading policies for social credit?
Well, essentially, it's the ability of the country's Reserve Bank to create credit or new money or print money, however you consider it, remembering that the money that we have, only 3% of the money system supply that we use is actually notes and coins. The other 97% is just computerized dots and dashes on a computer. And we think of it as money because we can use that when we use our credit card or when we direct transfer money from our phone or our computer into somebody else's bank account. But that's all digital money. But the Reserve Bank has the ability to create digital money, and that's what it's doing. As I said earlier, to the tune of $100 billion. And if you say that quickly, it doesn't sound like an awful lot. But when you're talking about $100 billion, that's an enormous amount of money. And we've always said that was possible. And over the years, we've been rubbished for that. People used to say, "Oh, that's just funny money. That'll never work. That can't happen." And of course, we now have the very thing happening that we've talked about that was possible. And it's not just happening in New Zealand. I mean, central banks across the world are creating enormous sums of money to try and support their economies during the economic consequences of COVID-19. However, how they're doing that is costing taxpayers a significant amount of money. And we've always said that the ability of the Reserve Bank to create new money, which is now clearly proven, should be used by that new money going directly to the government, which after all owns the Reserve Bank in the first place. I mean, they are kind of two separate rooms of the same institution, if you like. And we've always said that newly created money could go straight into the government's account for it to spend into the economy, supporting people, supporting businesses, building infrastructure, giving us greater capacity in hospitals and schools and all of the other things that that the government spends money on. Whereas the way that system works at the moment, the Reserve Bank is actually buying existing government debt of people who lent money to the government previously, and then the government is going out and borrowing money back off some of those people and off other investors. And of course, when the government borrows money, that means taxpayers have to pay interest on that money, and they have to repay the money at the end of the loan period. And so there's a significant cost to taxpayers with the way it's working at the moment. And we are saying, cut out the middleman, cut out the investors and the other banks that are lending the government money, and just give the money straight to the government so there's no cost to the taxpayer. Now that would save $13 billion over the next 3 years, just in the fees that the commercial lenders are getting from selling their government bonds back to the Reserve Bank. And it would also save about $4 to $5 billion a year in interest payments on the government's borrowing. And it would also save the government, through the taxpayer, having to repay that debt at the end. So there'd be an enormous sum of money that the government instead would have to be able to use on things that benefit people. Better hospital facilities, better education, more roads, better rail services, state housing for the 6,000 people that the government is paying to live in motels at the moment, for example, because they don't have anywhere to live. An immense number of things that we need to have done in the community, that suddenly there would be a great amount of money to be able to do.
So who are we borrowing the money off if we're not taking it from the Reserve Bank? Who are our commercial lenders?
Well, the commercial lenders are first and foremost the commercial banks, the privately owned commercial banks that operate in the New Zealand economy. And the four biggest are the Australian domiciled banks. I nearly said Australian owned, but that would be wrong because they're largely American owned.
Oh, wow.
But all of the banks lend money to the government, and also things like overseas pension funds and very large institutional investors.
So what's the big deal? How hard could it be to swap our lending over from there to the Reserve Bank? Why is this not happening?
Well, it's not actually hard at all, but there has been this phony Chinese wall set up over the years between the government and the Reserve Bank, so that the Reserve Banks, and it's not just in New Zealand, it's across the world, so the Reserve Banks are seen to be operating independently from the government. But remember earlier I said that the government owns the Reserve Bank, so it is really a phony Chinese wall that's been set up between them so that it looks as if they're independent, but they're not really. And so the ability for the Reserve Bank to fund the government directly is very simple. There's no magic about it. There's nothing that needs to be done other than the finance minister and the governor of the Reserve Bank agreeing that that's what they're going to do. But our Minister of Finance is not prepared to do that. Largely because I think he's not prepared to step out of what is considered to be orthodox economic management, and that is to retain the Reserve Bank as an independent kind of body. And I was interested to read just the other day a comment from Paul Keating, who's the former Treasurer in Australia and former Prime Minister, who said that the same debates going on in Australia with the Reserve Bank of Australia and the Australian government. And he said, look, the Reserve Bank is simply not doing what it should be doing in terms of funding the government directly, because it doesn't want to get out of step with other Reserve Banks across the world when it goes to the next Bank of International Settlements meeting and everybody says, hey, why are you guys doing that? And they're all going to have to go, well, we're not really sure about that.
Not playing nicely.
Yeah, so not playing the game the way it's supposed to be played.
Wow.
Which is all very well, but meantime, that stupidity is costing the taxpayers in terms of the facilities that New Zealanders should have in their hospitals and their education system and so on.
Is this something similar to what, and I don't want to bring this other country into it because I know that there's an uproar about it, but is this what President Trump is actually doing at the moment? Is he taking the money away from the lenders and bringing it back to their own American banks? Is that what's going on there?
Yeah, well, there are similarities to that, but of course, remember that the Federal Reserve, which is the Reserve Bank in America, is not owned by the American government. The Federal Reserve is owned by a chain of reserve banks that are part of the Federal Reserve system. New Zealand is very different. Australia is very different. the UK is different and Canada is different in that we all own our Reserve Bank. In other words, there's no private involvement in our Reserve Bank. But in America, it is essentially a privately owned institution, even though if it has any profits, a percentage of those profits are transferred back to the American government, but it's still a privately owned institution.
Yeah. So apart from us not wanting to play nicely, you know, or not wanting to be booted out of the team.
Yeah, it's not looking like we're not wanting to look like we're out of step with what everybody else is doing. And yet, you know, New Zealand has a reputation for being innovative and doing things differently. You know, the old number 8 wire mentality. And if you go back a little way in time, back to the 1930s, after the Depression, the government of the day that was elected, which happened to be a Labour government, actually did step out of line. And what it did was exactly what we're advocating. It nationalised the Reserve Bank, because prior to that, it was a privately owned institution as well. Yeah. So Michael Joseph Savage and his government nationalised the Reserve Bank and then said to the Reserve Bank, we have thousands of people without houses. We want you to fund the building of state houses. And the Reserve Bank did that. It didn't cost the taxpayer a single cent because the Reserve Bank created the credit to do that. And over the period of the 12 years that Labour were in power, they built 33,000 state houses using credit from the Reserve Bank. They didn't borrow the money from anywhere else. The Reserve Bank simply created the money that enabled builders and developers to actually build the houses and get people into those houses and give them a decent standard of housing. Yeah. And so it's not like it hasn't been done before. And the Labour government then used that facility of Reserve Bank credit to do lots of other things as well in the New Zealand economy. And then Australia did a similar thing, because the central bank in Australia was the Commonwealth Bank at that stage, and they created a lot of credit for the Australian government to use in investing in infrastructure and other projects. The same thing then happened in Canada as well. So, you know, what we're suggesting is not like it's something new and untried and hasn't been done before. It's been done before, it's been successful, but we've forgotten about that, and we've allowed ourselves to be strangled, if you like, by the commercial banks and the current way things are being done.
Yeah. So let's just say by way of a miracle, we just happen to flip over and go to the Reserve Bank tomorrow.
Yep.
What kind of economic situation are we in at that point? Because obviously we'd have taxes or interest to pay to those commercial lenders, and we'd have things that we owed them, right? So what would that look like economically for New Zealand?
Well, look, the Reserve Bank could do exactly what it's doing currently with the money that it's creating. It could just buy that debt back off those commercial lenders, and it would then become a debt that the Reserve Bank owns. But because the Reserve Bank is owned by the government, then effectively we kind of have borrowed the money off ourselves. And so the Reserve Bank could pull all that lending back in again, and then it could start creating new credit for the government to use to replace that lending that the government is doing, so that the government would have extra money to do more in the way of wage subsidies if it wanted to, or to support small businesses, or to support the tourist industry, or any of the other things that we need to be doing right now.
And I mean, even just based on this conversation, to me, it seems like common sense. And make me the Prime Minister and I'll grant your wish tomorrow. That's how it feels. It feels like, yes, this would be awesome for us economically. But tell me, if this is the game where we don't want to get kicked out of the team and we don't want to be seen to be the odd ones out, who's the top of the game? Whose game is it? What game are we playing?
Well, look, essentially, the international finance system is run by the World Bank, the Bank of International Settlements, and the IMF, and the American and British banks, which tend to control much of what goes on. However, inside that, New Zealand is a sovereign nation. It has its own Reserve Bank, which can create the money that it needs. So it's perfectly within New Zealand's ability to do that without being tied into what is conventional economic practice. And of course, convention has been thrown out of the window because up until now, nobody in New Zealand at least would have thought that the Reserve Bank could do what it's doing. So, those conventional things are being overturned. There are some possible consequences of us going down this road, and one could be that some of the international finance community could go, we don't really like the idea of New Zealand being able to use its own money. So we will put some pressure on, say, from America or the UK, on the governments to say, look, we want you to put some pressure on New Zealand because they look like they're going to be stepping outside of the tent and doing their own thing. So there could be some things like pressure on our exports to the US, where the US says, look, we're not going to, we're not going to import stuff from you to the same extent that we are. Britain could say the same, although that's not, that's an important but not a major market now for New Zealand because a large part of what we produce goes to China anyway. And that sort of economic pressure was exerted on the first Labour government when they instituted this process that I've been talking about. And they buckled under that pressure. But they were in a different situation because most of New Zealand's exports at that stage were going to Britain. And it was the private bankers in Britain who put the pressure on the British government to stop or threaten to stop imports from New Zealand into Britain. The situation is very different now because our markets are much more diversified. As I say, we export the bulk of our stuff to Australia and China, and yes, some to the US and some to other parts of the world, but we're not reliant on one importer as the 1935 Labour government was. And interestingly, China is very much doing what we in social credit are talking about in the way things should be done. China has enormous development going on right now. You've probably heard of the Belt and Road Initiative that China have instituted, which is essentially building infrastructure right across the world, largely focused on building a highway, and I say highway in inverted commas, a way of getting their products to Europe, because there's a big market there for Chinese manufactured products. And so the situation in China is that its central bank funds or provides funds to 6 big development banks, which are all Chinese government owned. And those 6 big development banks invest in infrastructure projects and the companies that build them, and the companies that supply the materials for them, like the steel and the concrete and the other things. And all of that comes from created credit from the Chinese central bank. So our market with China is not likely to be affected by anything that we might do in going down the same road as they are, because they're already doing it. So we would have much less disruption to our international trade if we went down the road that we're talking about than the first Labour government had back in 1935.
And I mean, I guess China would be probably the worst country. We wouldn't want to be out of favour with China. So if they're not contending against us in terms of this money, then it's not as scary. We could probably look into this. So how, from a complete naive standpoint, how many conversations have been had with our current Prime Minister about this, and what has been her response?
Not so much with the Prime Minister, because I'm not sure that the Prime Minister would know a great deal about the kind of stuff that we're talking about, but certainly with the Finance Minister. And Grant Robertson has said that he acknowledges it's perfectly possible to do what social credit is talking about and what some of these leading economists are talking about, because it's not just us. It's economists like Ganesh Nana, who's a very senior economist with Burl, who's an advisor to the government, advisor to numerous governments. Shamubir Lekwab, who's a senior economist and well quoted in New Zealand, numerous, and I could give you a list of a dozen or more just off the top of my head, but I won't bore you with the details. So they're all saying it's possible. Grant Robertson is saying it's possible. Adrian Orr, who's the governor of the Reserve Bank, is saying it's possible. Just none of them actually want to do it.
That's a very frustrating position to be in.
Well, it is, especially when you consider that if you put aside all of the technicalities that we've been talking about, and I appreciate, that's a bit technical for people who don't understand where money comes from in the first place. But the bottom line is there's an awful lot of money being wasted in this process that should be going into the things that New Zealanders need.
Yeah.
And I've mentioned those before. It sounds a bit like a broken record, but hospital care right now is in dire straits. I mean, we've got a situation where um, 6 top executives out of the Canterbury District Health Board have resigned in the past month.
I didn't hear about that. Why?
Yeah, they've resigned because they are under pressure to try and deliver the same level of services on less money.
Wow.
And they can't do it. And
Yep.
I mean, Christchurch has been through 2 major disasters. There was the earthquake and there was the mosque shootings.
Yep.
And so Christchurch Health Services, across a range of health services, not just the immediate things that you think about, like, people who need emergency operations for accident in either of those situations, but also the mental health services that have been overwhelmed as a result of those 2 incidents as well. So, Christchurch has had probably more pressure on its health services than any other particular part of New Zealand in recent times. And then those 6 top executives have said, look, we cannot live with ourselves anymore trying to deliver a standard of health care that we think is appropriate on the kind of money that you're asking us to do it on.
Mm.
And I mean, it's a stupid situation. They're not being funded enough, so they've been providing health services and getting into debt. In other words, they've spent more money than the government has allocated them. On top of that, all of our hospital boards have to pay what's called a 6% capital charge back to the government. So 6% a year on their hospital buildings and the land that those buildings are on. Now, what a crazy situation. I mean, the government owns those hospitals. Yeah. So why are the hospitals, out of the budget they get from the government, having to pay money back to the government for the buildings that they're operating out of?
Yeah, seems some pretty displaced taxes and.
Absolutely. And, just focusing again on health services, we have a private property developer in Wellington who is paying for and building a new children's hospital for Wellington. Now, that's a function of government to do that. It's not I mean, the fact that he's doing it is fantastic. Well, I think it's wonderful. But it's not a function of somebody who's a private property developer to be putting in place a hospital system or a hospital for kids in Wellington.
And that's how desperate the situation is, and that person has taken it on board themselves. Yeah,
absolutely. I'll give you another example. There's a charity hospital in Christchurch that's run by a group of doctors that do operations that people desperately need that the Christchurch hospital can't do, or that people can't afford to go and have done privately. Now, why have we got a charity hospital in Christchurch providing health care when the government has got this stupid situation going on where it could have billions of dollars to spare that is being wasted right now to put into that health system? We had another example, and the last one before I go off this, but I'm a bit passionate about the health situation. Yeah. We've got a group in Invercargill who are trying to raise money for a cancer unit in Invercargill because there isn't one. And that's as a result of a guy by the name of Blair Vining, who died of cancer fairly recently.
Oh, yes, I heard about him, bowel cancer.
That's right. Yep. And the reason he died was because our cancer treatment and diagnostic systems in the South Island are appalling. And so you've got his wife and a group of other people in Invercargill trying to raise money to build a charity-funded cancer unit in Invercargill. That is a government responsibility. The government has got the money to do something about it. It's just not taking the step to make sure that it does that.
Do you think, like, sometimes, I've had so many conversations now with so many different people, do you think that, it feels like sometimes that the government's tied in so many knots? It's like they can't just do any one thing because there's so many things holding everything up, red tape everywhere about everything, and it feels like we fundamentally get nothing done.
Yeah, look, I think there's an element of truth in that. The government in a way is like an ocean liner. It takes a long time for it to turn into a different direction. Yeah. It takes a long time for it to get going, and it takes a long time for it to stop. And so, if you think about it in those terms, it's like this enormous behemoth that we can't tweak and turn it in directions particularly quickly. But I don't think that that's the issue. I think the issue is that we have been stuck with a way of running our economy for a long time, and to some extent, as we said before, nobody's prepared to step outside of that, even though there is another option there. And until enough people start to get their heads around the fact that there is a different way of doing things, and they start to put pressure on the government to say these things that are happening, such as with the health system, such as with 250,000 kids living in a situation of poverty, such as 6,000 people living in motels paid for by the government because they've got no homes, and another 7,000 living in temporary accommodation, like emergency housing providers, motor camps, and all sorts of other places. Until enough people get angry enough about that and say to the government, look, this is not good enough, and they understand that there is a different way of doing things, which is actually not that different. A very small change would enable us to have a lot of money to address those issues. So until enough people understand that, then the government is not going to move, because there's not going to be enough pressure on it to move it in that direction.
So
And political parties and governments only change and adopt new ways of doing things when there's enough public pressure for them to do that, because when they're in government, they want to stay in government. And so therefore therefore they respond to the mood of the electorate. People are, if enough people are saying, we want you to do this, then the government goes, well, hang on, we better do something about that, because otherwise we're going to lose a lot of votes to another party.
And that's what I was going to just bring up. With some of the minority parties I've talked to, it sounds like a lot of the people who are in the parties are actually frontline workers as well, which means they're not career politicians, which means they actually know what the people are going through, and they know their suffrage, they know the different things, they know the concepts of what need to be pushed through into government, whereas a lot of those people in government have been career politicians, have been there forever. Do they really know what New Zealand wants, or is that why they're just sitting still and not being able, we can't push them into any one position, they're just staying still like big ocean liners.
Yeah, look, I think there's an element of truth to that, because if you're in that rarefied atmosphere all the time, you do tend to lose touch with what's going on down in the ground. But also those politicians have government departments that they have to try and move, and so they're getting pressured by the government departments to do this or that. I mean, I'm sure that for instance, Grant Robertson, as the Minister of Finance, is getting a lot of pressure from people in the Treasury that are telling him, oh no, you can't step out of line and do that. You've got to do it this way. And that, again, if I go back to that first Labor government, which was refreshing in a way, the majority of those new MPs in that Labor government were wharfies and farmers and blue-collar workers and steel workers, and they were people who had no real understanding about what makes government work, but they had a real understanding of what makes the real economy and people work. And so when they got in there, they didn't have the government department saying, oh no, Mr. John A. Lee, even though you're the Undersecretary of Housing, you can't do this. No, John A. Lee said, look, don't tell me why I can't do it. You go and tell me what you're going to do to make it happen.
Yeah.
And that's I think the difference too, in that people outside of the system are not so tied into accepting the way things are, and they're more prepared to be able to demand of the government departments and the bureaucracy, look, this is what we want. This is what, if we got into Parliament, this is what we told the voters we were going to do. You get on and tell me how it's going to happen. Don't tell me you can't make it happen.
And so when I'm referring back again to the minority parties, that because I've had so many conversations now with them, let you get that.
Sorry?
Yeah. there are quite a few feisty parties coming through, and they're saying that they want change for this government, and I agree personally. And when I look and talk to all these different minorities, all of it feels like, let's just put all these guys together and throw them into government, and then we'll see some change. What will you do if you can get into government? Like, what's your plan? Because I guess you can't go in at 21%, but if you can get in there, what do you think you'll do in there?
Yeah, well, sometimes I think that, just reflecting on that comment that you've made, that if all of the smaller parties actually did all get into Parliament, and National and Labour and New Zealand First were all gone, I don't think we would make any more of a hash of it than what the government is doing right now. Actually, it'd certainly be a lot more in the way of new ideas coming through, and that itself is interesting. I was at the launch last year of a book in Wellington by Professor Claire Robinson, who is a professor at Victoria University. And it was a book called Promises, 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 and it was about the way in which political parties had used election advertising to try and influence people to vote for them. Yeah. And one of the very interesting comments that she made at the launch of that book was this, that new ideas don't come from the status quo, the parties that are in Parliament. Yeah. New ideas come from, she called it, the fringes, where the smaller political parties are. Mm. And if you look back through history, most of the new ideas in politics have come from outside of the status quo, outside of the parties that are already in Parliament. Yeah. And, from social credit's point of view, for example, even though over our history we have had 6 MPs in Parliament during that time, but we've been largely outside of Parliament for more of that time than we've had somebody in Parliament. But we've been able to influence what has gone on. For instance, we were the first party in New Zealand to talk about New Zealand adopting an anti-nuclear stance, and we campaigned quite strongly on that through the 1970s and the early 80s, and that was eventually adopted by a Labour government. And then we were also very strong on campaigning for a change away from that first past the post voting system to a proportional voting system, not just because it would suit us, and obviously it would have done as we talked about that 1981 result, but because New Zealand had a series of minority governments. So we had less people who had voted for the government that was in power than had voted against it, and we felt that was unfair. And so we had long been campaigning for a change to the voting system, and effectively that 1981 vote was the catalyst that saw the voting system change to a proportional system. So that's just 2 examples of things that social credit has influenced quite strongly from outside of Parliament, reflecting back on Claire Robinson's thought that these new ideas come from the political parties that are outside of Parliament, not from the ones that are inside Parliament.
Yeah, and so that kind of is in line with my thoughts on minority voting, because I have heard the conversation thrown around quite a bit in the group and outside of this group that I'm facilitating, and that has been that don't waste your vote giving it to a minority, because then just say you're favouring National and they're like, oh well, Labour will get in then, and don't waste it, otherwise National will get in. So it's like people think that you have to just flip-flop between National or Labour, and those are your only 2 real legitimate choices. Whereas for me, I think, look, if enough people voted for who they aligned with their morals, values and policies, we would have, at least in the very least, a trajectory turner in government, somebody who can influence change, and that can be enough.
Look, absolutely. And, I guess over the years I've been involved with social credit, and as you know, it's a very long time. If all of the people who said, oh, look, we would really vote for you, but we don't want such and such to get in, or we want to get somebody out, and we think it's a wasted vote. If they'd actually stuck with their guns and said, look, we'll vote for you, they would get the change that they wanted. And we'd have a very different political scene right now. So, it is, I guess, a little bit of frustrating, especially when the smaller parties like us, who are outside of Parliament, don't have the taxpayer-funded resources to compete with National and Labour.
Exactly. And that's why I'm running this political series. Not to say that I'm, the big, huge, like audience. I mean, audience is a decent size, but I mean, at least if we can use this platform for something worthwhile, which I think is platforming the minority parties. And really that's a part of my frustration is seeing I don't particularly align to the bigger parties myself, and so when I went digging for more information, couldn't find it as readily as I could see. Labour and National, they're just there all the time. They're on I don't have a TV to watch. I mean, I do, but I don't watch TV. I haven't for 7 years, but if I had, they're on every day at 1 p.m. I've heard, and so it's this constant infiltration of these particular parties, whereas the other guy, plus they get the tax-funded money in huge volume to do their campaigning, and these other minorities are scratching for their place. And there needs to be more of a level playing field, even financially, for these parties. They should all get the same amount of blimmin' finances to run their campaigns and go for gold. That's my opinion on that.
Well, you are very much on the same page as Claire Robinson. In fact, she goes even further and suggests that the minor parties should get more funding because, because the level of inequality in that is enormous. Do you have any idea of what the sums involved are?
I know that Labour government's got something like 1 million, and then we've got minority parties that get 20,000 or something stupid.
Yeah. Well, that's the kind of thing. But it's not only that. On top of that, because they've got MPs in Parliament, all of their MPs can travel around the country free of charge. If I want to go to a political meeting in Wellington or Christchurch or Dunedin, the first thing I've got to do is go, have we got the money to do that? And if we haven't, how can I raise it? And does it come out of my pocket? And on top of that, they've got all the media entourage that's paid for. Like they all have press secretaries and media consultants and research assistants and all of the other stuff that goes with that. So it's not just the money they get for broadcasting during a campaign, it's all the other resource that goes behind that. My local MP here has been running full-page adverts and half-page adverts in the local newspaper for over 12 months. All of it paid for by parliamentary services, which is paid for out of taxpayers' money. I can't compete with that. I don't have that kind of resource. So it's an absolutely unequal battle for the smaller parties to try and compete in any way, shape or form with the larger parties. And then, as you say, you've got the media then turning it into a two-horse race. And so, Labour and National and a couple of the other parties that are in Parliament get all of the headlines and all of the media coverage. And again, the smaller parties get starved out of that. And in the end, for me, it's not so much about how that affects the parties involved, but the important people in this equation are the voters. And unless people have the opportunity to see what's being offered, how can they make a considered decision about what they want to support? So, if all they're seeing is National and Labour all the time, policy announcements on this and blah, 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 then they're not getting the full gamut of possibilities that they can look at to say, no, hang on, there's a party over there or there's an idea over there, that I support. So what we're getting is voters not given the opportunity to see what the options are, and therefore, again, reinforcing more of the status quo. And to me, the voters are the important part in this equation, not the parties.
Absolutely. And I mean, even as we're going through this series, I'm finding that there's all these different kinds of people. There are ones who are just pro-Labour and ones that are pro-National, and then ones that are, absolutely pro their minority. And then there are people who are just stop talking about it. I am not interested in politics. Just get away. about politics. And for me, I'm finding this incredibly interesting. I may not have been as into politics as I was before even this year, but the more I talk about it and the more parties I talk to, I think we all need to be interested in politics, because politics isn't actually politics. Politics is your whole life. It's your livelihood. It's what's going to happen with your kids and your grandchildren. It's what's going to happen with the food you put in your mouth, with the condition of your land. That's what politics is. And just the word politics puts people off. But if you repackage it and said, what you're voting for, these people that you're voting for are actually going to they're going to drive your livelihood or lack thereof. So understand who you're voting for and what you're voting for.
Absolutely, and I can understand people tuning out of politics, because in between elections, when you look at what goes on in Parliament, you look at it and go, why would I want to be interested in all the stupidity that goes on down there?
I know.
And so that's number one. Number two is that I think people feel that they're not going to have an influence anyway. For a lot of people, doesn't matter how I vote because it's not going to change the way things are.
People say that.
And so people tune out of that. And I think that's a disaster, because we need to be involving more people in the decision-making process. There was somebody on radio today who was 42 years old and had never voted. And I went, huh? 42 years old and you've never had a vote. You've never wanted to have an influence, even though it might be tiny, on what goes on and how all these decisions affect you. And I was doing a photo shoot 2 or 3 years ago, just outside where I live, on a nice bit of park, and there's a school just down the road, and the kids come out of the park sometimes and play. And so, as youngsters are, and these were sort of 13 and 14-year-olds, see something going on with a photo shoot, came up, wanted to know what it was all about. And I said to them, well, I'm hoping to become an MP at some point or other. And they said to me, what's an MP?
Yeah.
And I said, hang on, you don't know what what does an MP do? They had absolutely no idea. And that to me is criminal, really, that kids at that age have no understanding about what democracy is all about and how the system works, even if it's only the faintest amount of understanding at that level. And I think that we've got to start talking in our schools about civics and politics and what makes the world tick in that regard. Way more important than some of the stuff that I think gets taught to kids right now. And we need to have we've got 2 referendums going on this election, as you know. One is a binding one and one is a non-binding one. And Social Credit has always advocated that we should have a system where there are more binding referenda, where citizens can actually initiate a referenda. And if they get enough votes for it, it becomes a thing that the whole country votes on. And if enough people vote in favour, it becomes law, so that we actually have people making some of the decisions for themselves, not voting somebody in who they hope is going to make the right decision for them.
And I don't know whether it's laziness or hopelessness, but either of those things, we really, really need to have, more education in politics and how it actually works, because I really think, even with just having had conversations on both of those referendums, on the euthanasia, assisted dying bill and cannabis, we've had the discussions, and there are still so many people just saying, I'm voting yes because, and a really, really flippant reason for voting yes. And again, euthanasia, I'm voting yes, because, just really feels quite uneducated reasons for voting. And I just feel like we need to have more conversations, not just about politicians and parties, but actually how politics works, so that people know that actually it's supposed to be about us. It's actually supposed to be about us, the people. It's not supposed to be about politicians. That they are civil servants for the country. They are for us, or they're supposed to be anyway, aren't they?
Yeah. And you're reflecting my comments earlier about the inequities in the funding that when I said what it should be is about voters, not what parties want or get, but about what system we have that delivers the best information for voters to be able to make a decision on what they want.
Yeah.
And then a system that encourages people to be involved, not encourages people to tune out.
Yeah.
Switzerland uses referenda a lot. And a lot of people go, oh, look, you can't have, binding referendums for every decision that government has to make. And the answer is, of course you can't. Yeah. But on important ones like, the country joining the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, for instance, where you had enormous numbers of New Zealanders out protesting on the streets about that, marches up Queen Street with thousands of people participating. Those kind of issues, there should have been a referenda on that people could get involved in and make a decision over a big issue like that. And then all of the stuff that's built around that, because people would need to know, what's it about? How's it going to work? How's it going to affect us? All of the intricacies of making that decision should be out there, and people should be getting involved in that. But we're getting further and further away from that because of the internet to a large extent, which provides a lot of misinformation rather than real information. And also because our traditional media that used to provide us with a lot more in the way of investigative journalism have now downsized because their advertising revenue has gone off to Facebook and Google and all of the other internet giants. So all of our traditional media are under pressure to survive, and they don't have the resources anymore to provide the investigative, in-depth journalism that we used to get. And so therefore, people reading the paper or watching TV don't get the in-depth analysis of what's going on. So, in a way, we're getting further and further away from people having any say in what goes on. And I think we should be trying to reverse that.
I totally agree. I mean, you already see how people, and again, I don't know whether this is a thing of hopelessness, but we're becoming quite robotic in a way, and that's probably even to do with the internet, but we're just getting so disconnected from reality, I think, just as a people. And maybe we're so disconnected that we're just now saying, just do what you want, government, look after us. A lot of the voters that I know that are voting Labour back in this time are saying things like, well, we felt safe. She looked after us, Jacinda Ardern looked after us during this COVID. She protected us and we feel safe. So, if she's going to make us feel safe, they just want more of the same. I don't know, maybe I'm a little bit more skeptical than that, and I look a little bit more into policy, but I don't know. I don't want to be made to feel safe.
Look, I can understand people having those feelings. And again, this is a rather unusual time. It's not the kind of situation that we've had in the last 30 or 40 years. And so I can understand people being in that mindset right now, but as I say, this is an unusual time. It's not the ordinary way that things would be playing out.
They did call it a COVID election. Labour did call this a COVID election, and I guess it kind of is, yeah.
Yeah, well, it is. And I mean, what it has provided us with actually is a fantastic opportunity to take a look at how we've done things economically, job-wise, in so many ways, and say, can we build something out of this that is so much better? Not just go back to what we had before, get back to people working longer hours to earn more money, to pay, bigger house prices, to spend less time with their kids than they used to. I know while there have been a lot of negatives about what's gone on with this virus and the economic response to it, I think there have been a lot of positives. I mean, we had 6 weeks where people were stuck at home with their kids. They actually spent time with their children. Heaven forbid.
I know, heaven forbid.
Yeah. I mean, and that was fantastic. The kids were learning to cook.
Yeah.
They were doing creative stuff. They were making videos with their parents. They were They were collaborating online with, with other kids in other parts of the world, and creating music and art and all sorts of stuff. An opportunity that we would normally not get because, for an example, I mean, my stepdaughter who is in Australia, she and her partner have an hour and a half to travel into work. And so they leave their children at 6 in the morning before school care and travel into town. They've got the cost of travel and the stress with travel. They've got the cost of parking vehicles. And then they've got the same thing at the end of the day. So they get home at 7 o'clock at night. And the kids have been in after school care. So parents are stressed when they get home. They've got this big day traveling at work. And the only time they get to spend with their kids is a bit over the weekend when they're not trying to catch up on household chores and so on. During this situation, people haven't been able to go to work. They haven't had all that stress and the cost of travel. They've had to stay at home. So many of us now are working from home. And in the case of this family, my stepdaughter is now working from home full time. She goes into the office about once a month just to have a catch-up meeting with people. She's working from home, so she's there right until the kids go to school. She's there when the kids get home from school. She's not stressed because she hasn't been dicing with the traffic and all the other stuff. She's had time to think about what she's going to cook for dinner. And the kids get home, she's spending quality time with them after her work hours. Their life has changed so dramatically, and I mean that's one of the advantages I see out of the situation that we've had, that we can rebuild or build a much better way of doing things out of this crisis, if you like. So that's one example.
Yeah, and so they were just thrown into that, unwittingly. Nobody knew how that was going to turn out, and it just happened to have turned to her favour. And maybe this is the same thing that could happen if we, flip to the Reserve Bank. Maybe all of our fears would be resolved, and we would be like, oh, this is this is resolved very well. Why aren't we taking a risk in that way then?
Yeah, well, I think it's always easy to sort of stick with the status quo. The majority of us don't take to change willingly. It's like the old pair of slippers, they feel comfortable. So, we just keep on wearing them until they eventually fall out our feet, and then we have to go and get a new pair. But, we have this opportunity, marvelous opportunity to do things differently, to build a better society and a better world out of this crisis. And I think we should be looking to do that in whatever way, whatever small way or large way. And, what we're talking about with the use of the Reserve Bank is kind of a large way, but that shouldn't be a reason not to do it. It wasn't a reason for Ed Hillary not to climb Everest, for instance, because it was a big thing to do. It wasn't a large thing for the first man to get in a spacecraft and go off to the moon. It was, but we still did it.
Somebody do it, yeah.
Yeah. And so that's on the large side, but there are all these small things that we can do with encouraging people to work more from home. So there's less traffic on the roads, less pollution of the environment.
Yeah.
And then finding ways to get to know your neighbours more. I mean, there were people during the lockdown who for the first time ever spoke to their neighbour.
Yeah, exactly.
Might have been, at a fair distance between them, but they still spoke to their neighbour. People were out there doing exercise classes in their street.
Cul-de-sac, yeah.
Each outside their own front gate, and not, but they were actually getting to know their neighbours.
Yeah.
So there's all these things that we could look at and go, can we build something better out of this?
Yeah. Change is good. Now I'm just having a look at some of your policies down the side of here, and tell me a little bit about community credit.
Well, community credit is effectively using the Reserve Bank, but also not just funding the government. It's about funding things that local councils do and local organisations do. Now, if your local council wants to improve the sewage system or water system, or build a local community centre, there's not enough in the way of ratepayers' money coming in to do that, so they go off to the private sector and borrow that from a bank. Under a social credit system, they would be able to come to the Reserve Bank and go, okay, Mr. Reserve Bank, can we have that money from you? And the Reserve Bank would go, yes, you can. You don't have to pay any interest on it because we're not a commercial organisation that requires to get a return on that money, provided your ratepayers have agreed in your annual plan that they want that community centre to go ahead, or they want the sewage system to be upgraded. Then you can have that money and you can pay it back again. It's a loan, it's not a gift, but you can pay it back without any interest. Now, my local council here pays a top side of $12 million a year just in interest. So that's $12 million of ratepayers' money that's going off to commercial investors.
Yeah.
That $12 million could be halfway towards a new community centre, and that's every year.
Yeah.
So the idea of community credit is to provide from the Reserve Bank the money that that communities need to be able to do those kind of things. And if we're going to get even a little bit more technical, actually, when they go to a bank to borrow it, that's what the bank does anyway. The bank creates that money and the bank lends them the money, but the bank wants a return on its investment.
That's right. That's right. I'm just a bit flabbergasted actually over the whole thing, because I mean, it seems like such common sense, and it just seems like, why wouldn't we give it a go? What have we got to lose at this point?
Very little, actually, but it's just getting that change in people's mindset that says, it might be possible, so let's give it a go. Because most people, I mean, you surprised me with what you just said, because I said to you that when a council goes to a bank and borrows money, the bank creates that money and lends it, and you just went, yeah, I understand that. Now, most people don't. Most people think that when you go to the bank and get a loan, the bank takes money that people have put into the bank and deposited and lends it to you, because that's how we've been brought up. But it's not the way it works. Banks don't do that. Banks are not allowed to lend out their deposits. What banks do is they create new money every time they give somebody a loan. But most people don't understand that. So getting their head around that concept is really difficult, because we've been brought up to understand that that's not how it works. So part of getting new ideas over the line is getting people to accept that something they've thought worked this way for all their lives actually doesn't work that way. It works somehow different. So the first thing that people have to do is go, hang on, I've been wrong. I mean, for 45 years, I've thought it worked this way, and you're telling me that that's wrong?
But you know, the thing is it comes down to a simple conversation sometimes, but it's just the fact of, how do you get these conversations out to the people? How do you
doing exactly what you're doing, actually, because I don't know how many people are looking in on this and how many people have written it off as a load of rubbish so far, but a percentage of people will have gone, hang on, is there something there I don't understand, or that sounds like a good idea, or whatever it happens to be. And so it's just that continuing series of conversations that we have to have with people to allow them to question what they might have thought and to open their eyes to what possibilities there might be.
My eyes have been so incredibly open during the series, and I mean I had a lot of adversity coming into the series. I actually lost all of my moderation team who look after, helped me facilitate the group, because they were so anti-politics and the discussion that they said they didn't want to be involved, and they left. So I had to contend with that first, because I thought, my goodness, I could either say, yeah, okay, you're right, let's not talk about politics, but I just thought the selection is terrifyingly it's terrifying coming up to the election, but it's incredibly important. Like, probably this is one of the most important elections I've ever known in my my lifetime, and I don't understand that people can't see the importance of this election. So I thought, yeah, I'm going to lose people in the group. I'll lose people who just think, oh, this has turned into a political page, and people have said that, but I'm willing to take that risk, because I feel like it's so incredibly important to have these conversations. We need to be informed. We need to be. It's so important.
Yeah. Well, look, congratulations on that. I can only absolutely admire you for what you've done. I hope that some of those people will come back to you and go, well, actually, there was some interesting stuff there.
So interesting. So interesting.
if they don't, I guess, then that's the way it's going to be. But talking about ideas and concepts and what's possible, I mean, gee, that's interesting stuff, wherever it comes from.
Totally, I agree. Now, I wanted to ask you, because you seem like the person to ask, and it may be off topic to just New Zealand, but I've been interested in a while. What actually happened to Venezuela so that their whole economy? They came from weren't they one of the luscious places in the world, and now they are.
Well, they're still a very wealthy country, and they have enormous oil reserves. Because it's interesting you should say Venezuela, because when I talk to people, and we've been doing a lot of Facebook advertising in the run up to the election campaign, and there are lots of people who put up posts that go, "Oh, rubbish! You're just going to turn New Zealand into a Zimbabwe or a Venezuela," which is the kind of reaction that people have because they haven't thought about it. Wow. So I've answered that question a lot. So what happened to Venezuela is that that if you know anything about American politics, the US have been very involved in South America, and America over many years have been involved in influencing what goes on in politics in South America, and America have backed people that they have favoured to take power in various countries in the South America, in the same way as they have in the Middle East and other countries around the world as well, because America wants to control everything if it can. So there's been a lot of political involvement in those South American countries, and America were a little bit disturbed about what was going on in Venezuela, because the regime in Venezuela was starting to go down the road of what we've just been talking about for the last hour or so, and that is using their own resources to run their own country. The one problem that Venezuela had was that they had allowed the Americans to come in and invest a lot in their productive sector, particularly their oil industry, and Venezuela has some of the largest oil reserves in the world. So a lot of their industry, their big industry, was dominated by American companies. And so when the US banks saw what was starting to happen in Venezuela, with them wanting to use their own resources to run their own country, they put pressure on the American government, and they basically shut down the Venezuela economy. And so what that did was that the Venezuelan government then tried to get themselves out of that situation by creating money, but because there was no productive base there on which that money could operate, they got themselves into problems. And that happened in Zimbabwe for different reasons. But with Zimbabwe, as you probably know, a lot of the white settlers were driven out of Zimbabwe off the farms, because Mugabe wanted the Africans to have control of it, particularly his tribe, if you like. A lot of their manufacturing industry was decimated, so effectively they had no productive economy there to base their creation of money on, and so they had skyrocketing inflation. But in a situation like New Zealand or Australia or any of the other more developed countries, where we've got a good functioning, a productive economy, in other words, where farms are producing some stuff, where industry is producing stuff, where we've got secondary industry going on, the new credit coming into the economy can be used by that productive base, and we wouldn't have that same situation that ended up in Venezuela or in Zimbabwe.
I'm so happy to have this conversation. I mean, I probably could have Googled it, but it just is way more interesting hearing it from somebody who knows what they're talking about. The other thing about farming, okay, you're saying that we wouldn't have this situation because, we're productive, we've got farming, we've got different things. This current government seems to be not being very helpful to farmers. So is there is this, is it not working hand in hand with the agenda that Labour government had for New Zealand, the social credits ideas?
Look, I think the difficulty that the Labour government have had is that they've had to work with the Greens, and the Greens are pretty radical when it comes to environmental policies. And so I think what we've had is the farmers being turned into scapegoats for pursuing of environmental stuff that is unnecessary. Now, let me just qualify that to this extent to say that I'm not against us improving the way we do things environmentally, and improving our water quality, and making sure that we deal with plastics and rubbish and all the other things to reduce our pollution to the greatest extent. All of those are just common sense things to do. But if you compare the way in which farmers have been turned into scapegoats against what levels of pollution into the waterways there are in our cities, the comparison is just ridiculous. We have pipelines running from sewage plants in our cities that put raw sewage out into the sea when our sewage systems can't cope with with the
we have that here where I live. We have that when we have a bit too much of a storm, off it all goes out and we can't swim in the water for whatever period of time. Absolutely.
Now, I mean, that's where we should be focusing our environmental focus on, not the farmers who generally there are some farmers who don't do the job well, but generally farmers look upon themselves as guardians, not owners.
Yeah, that's exactly.
As guardians of the land.
Some
of them, for many of them, they've been family farming for generations on that piece of land, and they very much want to ensure that they pass it on to the next generation in as best condition as they can.
Yeah,
and that includes not just their farm, but the waterways that run through it and everything.
That's exactly right. So I had an interview with Bristol Grow Farm, Susan Hamming down there, and we had this conversation because we were talking about the new law that the government has brought in for their pugging of their farm and the waterways and all that. And she said the same. She said, like in any industry, there's always your bad eggs. There's always farmers who might be a bit lazy or just but I don't know, non-conformative, I suppose. But she said for the most part, we love, our animals. We love our animals. We know our animals. We love them. We care for them. They all get the best of care, the best of love. And, she even talked about animal emotions and how she learned about a certain way that their fur goes when they're all happy and basking in the sun. So, I mean, they love what they do. Their family, for 100 years owning a farm. And it's like they love the place. Why would they want to destroy it? They don't want to destroy it. So I think you're right. I think we're focused on the wrong pollutions from the wrong places. And plus our farming is, productive. It's something that, it's for our economy, whereas our, cities and things like that, we need to address pollution here. And
we absolutely do. But I think one of the things that's changed probably in the last 40 years is that for a lot of our farming sector, it's gone from family-owned farms that had been that family on the land for generations to a situation where we had in 1984 where Roger Douglas let loose this neoliberal economic experiment on New Zealand, where people could borrow money from a bank and it was all about what's good for me, not what's good for the community, but how can I increase my wealth? And so we've had a lot of farms that have changed hands and become corporate farms rather than individual family farms, where there are some farming enterprises that own thousands and thousands of acres, and so the personal responsibility for the land and what goes on in it has been divorced from the land. The ownership is no longer on the land, it's away from the land. Often investors who really have no connection with the land itself. Their involvement is to make as much money as possible. So we've had a situation of that. And we then had a situation where some individual farmers have seen that going on, and in order to protect themselves, they've extended themselves to buy the farm next door and to take another loan out from the bank. And so what we've got is essentially a bank-driven requirement to produce more and more off less and less land, because you've got to pay the bank back. You've got to be able to pay the interest and the debt back. And so that's led to overstocking, to a situation where farmers, in many cases, not because they want to, but because they've had to. They've had to try and get more in the way of production off their land than the land can really withstand, largely because they're ad hoc to the bank to the extent that they are. So that's a trend that we need to reverse. We need to go back to a situation where farmland is owned by family farms who have a pride in looking after it as custodians of the land. And there are still plenty that do, but there are lots that don't. And where they're not in hock to the bank for so much, and they don't have to try and overproduce off the land that they've got, because that, to a large extent, is what's driving the pollution and the degradation of our streams and so on.
Amazing. What are our current laws around foreign ownership of land? Because I was just having the conversation yesterday with one of the other ladies about is it Silverfern Farms that was sold off, 50% of it was sold off to China, was it? When did that happen, and why, and how did we stop that sort of thing?
Well, look, it's Silverfern Farms is just one example. There are farms, hundreds of hectares, thousands of hectares of farmland being sold to overseas owners as we speak. The Overseas Investment Office is approving them. There are big chunks of our agriculture, not just farming animals or milk production, but also horticultural land and horticultural businesses that are now in overseas ownership. Lots of them in Chinese ownership.
That's just
So there's almost no. You could say there's almost no restriction, provided that as an overseas owner you can prove that you've got good character and you're supposedly going to invest into New Zealand with what you're doing and make things better. Then basically the Overseas Investment Office just gives you the tick, and that's an interesting subject to get onto, because social credit has over the last year taken the Overseas Investment Office to the High Court. We have actually instituted a judicial review of the Overseas Investment Office's decision to allow a Chinese company to buy Westland Milk Products, which was the second largest processor of milk in New Zealand, behind Fonterra. Fonterra is the largest. And we believed that that transaction should never have been approved. And certainly not approved in the way it was, that it wasn't scrutinised properly, that the Overseas Investment Office didn't do the job properly. And it's cost us many, many thousands of dollars to take that case to the High Court for the judicial review. And we don't know what the final decision is yet. We will know in the next few weeks, I guess. But nobody else was prepared to stand up and do that. Other political parties expressed disappointment about it and said, it shouldn't happen and we shouldn't be selling this off to overseas, but nobody else actually did anything about it. And although we can't stop the process because it's already, the sale has already gone ahead, at least we felt we could make sure that the Overseas Investment Office was doing its job properly and scrutinising those kind of deals.
And that's what I mean about these trajectory turners. When you place a vote on a minority party or a party that may not compete with the bigger parties in terms of actual winning, you're putting people in there who are passionate about your country and passionate about things that we should care about in this country. And I think that it's really, really important to put your vote where your values are, because people like you are the ones who will actually really fight for this country.
Yeah, well, for me, to be perfectly honest, I can't think of anything worse than ending up with a job being stuck in Parliament as an MP. It kind of makes me wonder what I'm doing, but it's the only way that I can have enough influence on what goes on in the country, if I ever get there, that I can make some of those changes that I'm passionate about and that social credit as a party has been so passionate about for such a long time. And if it requires that I end up perhaps as an MP and living the life of an MP, then to achieve those changes, it's worth doing that.
That's an interesting comment from you as well, because you're not the first and probably not the last of these candidates who have got this exact same philosophy that I am not really a willing MP, but I really, really care and I want to make a difference. So, I mean, thank goodness for people like you. I feel like I would never ever want to be an MP no matter what. I don't know if I would have enough passion. I think I'd probably blow a valve if I was trying to do this all the time. These interviews are enough for my brain. They're just enough for me. So I just think that I really honour what you're doing. I think it's amazing, and I think what your party stands for is phenomenal, and people need to learn more about it.
Well, look, thank you for that. And I might say, I mean, we've talked about only a very small amount of what social credit's all about in terms of its policy. I mean, we've got way wider policies than that. We've got ideas about how we should be dealing with the advent of new technology, with robotics taking over from many of the jobs that people traditionally have had. Ideas about how we do that no other political parties, certainly not the main ones, have even given any thought to yet. But it's not just us that are passionate, or me that's passionate about it. I mean, there are lots of passionate people in New Zealand trying to better the community, trying to stop some of these things happening. There's a group in Christchurch who are protesting, and also are going to take a court case against overseas companies being granted rights to extract thousands of gallons or litres of water and export it overseas as bottled water. Those are people who are
last night too.
who are giving up their, all of their time and a lot of their money to oppose what's going on. So there are lots of passionate people in New Zealand trying to better the community. We really should find a way to enable them to do what they're doing and take all of those improvements and try and put it together in some sort of a way that benefits the community as a whole.
I've got a horrible feeling that even though to me I think I'm winding up this political series and we're coming up to Saturday and I'm thinking, yay, this is going to be the end of this for me, I've got this funny feeling that this kind of, I don't know, journalistic curiosity in me about the things of New Zealand might not end. I'm not sure yet.
Well, look, that's fantastic. I mean, I would love more people to be doing what you're doing, because it is providing people like me with a wider platform than I would otherwise have. But more importantly, it's actually exposing the people that connect with you to ideas that they might not have thought about either, and to things that they might find interesting and want to get involved in. And it's the kind of journalism that the internet has enabled, that I think is really, really valuable and should be pursued.
And it's nice for me because I mean I learn every time I have a conversation with someone. I learn something new, and I get to just ask from a curious perspective, not as somebody who is overly qualified at asking questions, just as an average New Zealander who wants to have some answers. So it's quite nice being able to ask from this perspective and learn. We could just talk for hours, I think.
I was just going to say, I mean, that's one of the advantages that you've got over the ordinary journalist in a way, because the ordinary journalist is looking at what they can write in a story. And you're not doing that. You're going, what can I find out? What can I extract out of the person I'm talking to that's going to be of interest, that's going to interest me and is going to interest the people that are connected with me? And I think that's really way more valuable than what most journalists do, because they're very restricted in what they can ask, because they're always looking at how many words they're going to be allowed to write in the article that they finally write out of it.
Yeah, and how explosive it's going to be and how many views they're going to get. And I mean, I don't focus on the views. I know we'll get the views, but I don't focus on that. I just focus on trying to get answers to questions. So hopefully for social credit, we've done a little tiny bit of justice tonight, even though I'm looking at your policies right now and I've seen there's a lot of them, and I've read through some and they're really amazing. So what I'll do is I'll link those, your website to this chat.
Fantastic.
and then I'll pop it up on YouTube as well. And then if you want to share that out, you can do that as well. Otherwise, best of luck for the rest of your campaign week, and let's see what happens on election day.
Look, thank you very much. I've really enjoyed it. I appreciate the opportunity, and it's, the campaign for me doesn't finish on Saturday.
No.
Because there's lots of fabulous ideas that I think we've got that I think would interest people. So I'd be really happy to do it again if you ever want to be back on.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for chatting.
My pleasure.
Talk soon.
Okay, bye.
Okay, bye. Oh, that was really good. Okay, I just stopped that live stream right then, so I can just say thank you so much for your time. That was really, really excellent. Really enjoyed that.
Well, so did I. And just, again, hopefully some of the people that connect with you will find it interesting as well. And, in the end, whether it influences them to vote for social credit, would be nice. But if it doesn't, if it at least has opened their eyes to possibilities and made them question some of the things that they might have thought before, then that in itself has got to have been well worth the time.
And for me, again, like I said, I didn't know a lot about social credit, and as I'm getting to the end of this sort of series, I'm thinking, okay, now who haven't I talked to? And people are saying, oh, this one and that one, and now I'm like, wow, this is an amazing political party, and why have I not heard about this one, to the extent of other ones? So really, really interesting point, and just makes me feel like it's really good to be showcasing these.
New career on the horizon.
Oh, don't say it. People keep on threatening me with that. I'm like, oh no, I'm quite happy just not doing this.
Oh no, and I'm not talking about not a career in politics, but a career in internet journalism.
Yeah, I know, exactly. Oh, I don't know. Oh, maybe I will. I don't know.
Well, there's so many interesting things and people to talk to about there. People have got ideas about such an amazing amount of stuff. If I wasn't doing what I was doing, I'd spend all my time investigating, because there's so much I want to find out about.
Isn't that right? So interesting, because I'll do my daytime job, and then I'm all the time thinking, who am I going to talk to next? So I do these at nighttime. My kids should be in bed, and they're not. And but they know that this is what I do at nighttime now. So maybe it might just become my nighttime job.
And what do you do during the day?
Well, it's interesting because the community that I've got is kind of a little bit monetized with skincare that I work for, a place that I work for. And so that's my main bread and butter.
Oh, yeah.
And I had looked at all different ways to monetize this community, because that's the whole reason I opened it several years ago. I'm a single mum. I have 4 children, and way back then I had I was like, what am I going to do? It's sink or swim here. It's either grow my business or go on to a benefit, which I was never going to do. So it was this community. So I've been able to live on my skincare product, but now this has opened up. It's very, very interesting. I'm not sure where it's going to go, but who knows? Hey, who knows?
Well, you may be able to monetize this kind of thing as well. Internet provides wonderful possibilities these days, doesn't it?
That's so true. Okay, well, thanks so much for chatting, and we will catch up again soon.
Yeah, look, I'd certainly look forward to that.
Thanks, Chris.
Okay, nice to meet you.
You too. Bye.
Bye-bye.